Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a land so wealthy that it didn't just trade with the world, it powered it. A land where cotton was softer than anything Europe could produce, where spices were worth more than gold, where artisans crafted textiles so fine that queens and kings proudly wore them. Now imagine that same land within just 2 centuries being reduced to famine, poverty, and debt. This is not a fictional story. This is the story of India, and more importantly, the story of how India built Britain's wealth. For hundreds of years, India wasn't just another country on the map. It was the economic heart of the world, one of the richest civilizations on Earth. It's contributing nearly a quarter of the entire global GDP. From the bustling ports of Bengal to the vibrant markets of Gujarat, India was a magnet for global traders: Arab, Portuguese, Dutch, French, and eventually the British. But Britain didn't just come to trade, they came to take. And what followed is one of the most extraordinary economic transformations in human history, an empire rising on the systematic draining of another nation's wealth. In this video, we're going to uncover the real story behind the British Empire. This astonishing rise, how it was fueled not by British innovation alone, but by Indian money, Indian resources, and Indian labor. We'll break down how a private company, the East India Company, arrived as merchants and slowly took control as rulers. Rewriting India's economy to serve Britain's interests, you'll discover how Indian industries, especially textiles, were deliberately crushed. How farmers were forced into poverty. How taxes collected from Indians were used to fund Britain's wars, Britain's industrial revolution, and even Britain's railways. And most shocking of all, how India's wealth was extracted so efficiently that by the time the British left in 1947, India's share of the world economy had fallen from 24% to just 4%. This is not just history. This is the economic blueprint of colonization. The story of how the world's richest country was drained to build another. Get ready, because the truth isn't just surprising, it's uncomfortable, powerful, and long overdue. Welcome to how India built Britain's wealth. Before the British arrived, India was not a poor or struggling land. It was one of the world's most advanced and prosperous civilizations. In the early 1700s, India contributed nearly 1/4 of the world's total GDP, making it an economic superpower. The Mughal and regional kingdoms oversaw thriving trade networks that stretched from East Asia to Europe. India was globally famous for its textiles, especially muslin, silk, and cotton, the finest fabrics on the planet. Spices, jewelry, metalwork, shipbuilding, and agricultural productivity made it a destination for merchants from across the world. Indian cities like Dhaka, Surat, and Murshidabad were global business hubs. While rural India produced abundant crops and artisan goods, the economy was largely self-sustaining, with advanced irrigation systems, flourishing markets, and skilled craftsmen. Education, science, and mathematics also had deep roots. India had universities centuries before Europe's oldest institutions. To European traders, India was not some remote colony, it was the crown jewel of global commerce. This immense wealth attracted the Portuguese, Dutch, French, and ultimately the British. When Britain looked at India, they didn't see a nation, they saw a treasure chest. They were determined to open it at any cost. The British initially arrived in India in the early 1600s as harmless merchants through the East India Company, a private trading corporation. Their goal was simple: buy Indian goods, textiles, spices, opium, and sell them in Europe for massive profits. But as competition from Portuguese, Dutch, and French traders grew, the British realized something: India was too valuable to simply trade with. They wanted control, not commerce. Slowly, the company began building soldiers, forming alliances, and interfering in local politics. The turning point came in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey, where the British defeated the Nawab of Bengal using bribery, manipulation, and military force. This victory gave them control over Bengal, India's richest province, on unimaginable wealth. Once the company tasted political power, the transformation was unstoppable. In just a few decades, they evolved from traders to rulers, expanding their control across India. With political authority in one hand and military power in the other, the East India Company began reshaping India's economy to serve British interests. Taxes, land, industries, and trade policies were all redesigned for extraction. India became a colony not through diplomacy but through corporate greed, backed by a private army. The British didn't loot India in the traditional sense, no armies carrying treasure chests out of palaces. Their method was far more calculated and far more damaging. Economists call it the drain of wealth. This meant Britain was able to extract India's wealth without giving anything back. Here's how it worked. Britain bought Indian goods, cotton, indigo, tea, opium, but instead of paying India, they used taxes collected from Indians themselves. So Indians produced the goods and paid Britain for buying them. All the profits were transferred to London. Nothing stayed in India. Indian rulers were forced to pay huge tributes to Britain. The cost of British officials' salaries, army expenses, administrative costs, and even personal pensions of officers living in England were all paid by Indians. Imagine paying taxes so that another country's empire can grow. That was India's reality. Trade was controlled, industries were dismantled, and India became a supplier of raw materials while Britain became the manufacturer. India's wealth was being silently drained every single year. By the 19th century, its drain amounted to millions of pounds annually, the financial engine powering Britain's global expansion. And India, once a wealthy economy, began sliding toward poverty. Before colonization, India's textile industry was world-renowned. Indian fabrics were so fine and affordable that they dominated European and Asian markets. This threatened British textile manufacturers who couldn't compete with India's superior quality. So Britain took a brutal economic approach. Destroy the Indian industry, protect the British one. They imposed impossible taxes on Indian weavers, while British cloth entered India with almost no taxes at all. This meant Indian products became expensive, while British machine-made cloth was cheap. Millions of Indian artisans lost their livelihoods. Some reports even describe British officials cutting off the thumbs of weavers to stop them from producing muslin, whether symbolic or literal. The message was clear: destroy competition. Textile towns like Dhaka, once the Manchester of the East, collapsed into poverty. Shipbuilding, steel, and handicrafts met the same fate. India's economy was re-engineered to supply raw materials, cotton, jute, indigo, while Britain processed them and sold them back at higher prices. This wasn't market competition, it was economic warfare. The British Industrial Revolution was built on the ruins of Indian industries, turning a nation of skilled artisans into a land of impoverished farmers. One of the darkest consequences of British rule in India was the series of catastrophic famines that struck the country repeatedly. These were not natural disasters alone, many were man-made, a direct result of British economic policies. India historically had strong systems of local storage, community granaries, and emergency relief during droughts. But the British dismantled these systems because they interfered with revenue collection. Farmers were forced to grow cash crops like indigo, cotton, tea, and opium instead of food grains. When droughts hit, there was no food buffer left. Even worse, during severe famine years, the British continued exporting wheat and rice from India to Britain and other colonies. This meant that while millions starved, ships loaded with Indian food sailed out of the country. The most tragic example was the Bengal famine of 1943, where over 3 million people died. Yet there was no shortage of food, only a shortage of compassion. British leadership refused to release grain, prioritizing war supplies for Europe. By the time the British left, nearly 30 million Indians had died in famines, numbers unprecedented in human history. These famines were not accidents. They were the result of prioritizing British profit over Indian lives. The British often claim that railways were their greatest gift to India. But the truth is very different. The railways were not built for Indians. They were built to extract India's wealth efficiently. Every major railway line connected mines, plantations, or ports to cities where raw materials were shipped to Britain. The goal was simple: move cotton, coal, opium, tea, timber, and grain quickly and cheaply to British factories. Even the financing of railways was exploitative. The British introduced a guaranteed return system, meaning private British investors were guaranteed profits paid entirely by Indian taxpayers. Indians bore the risk, while British investors enjoyed the rewards. Construction materials such as steel, engines, and machinery were all imported from Britain, turning railways into another channel for siphoning Indian wealth. Indians also had to pay some of the highest railway fares in the world relative to income, while British officials traveled cheaply in subsidized luxury. Railways did unite India geographically, but economically they were designed like blood vessels pumping resources outward, not inward. They strengthened the empire, not the country. So yes, India got railways, but at a financial cost so high, it drained more wealth than it provided. Numbers tell a story that words alone cannot. When Britain began its rule, India's share of the global economy was around 24%, almost equal to Europe's entire GDP at the time. By the time the British left in 1947, India's share had fallen to just 4%, a collapse unprecedented in economic history. According to modern economic research, Britain extracted an estimated $45 trillion from India over its rule. This was done through taxes, trade manipulation, forced cultivation, resource extraction, and the drain of profits to London. Not a single pound of this was reinvested back into Indian development. During British rule, India's life expectancy dropped to 32 years, and literacy rates fell instead of rising. Indian industry shrank, agriculture stagnated, and per capita income barely grew for nearly 2 centuries. Meanwhile, Britain transformed from a small island nation to the world's richest empire. London's financial institutions, infrastructure, and industrial growth were heavily fueled by profits from India. British wars in Europe, the Opium Wars, and even colonial expansion in Africa were financed using Indian tax revenue. These numbers make one thing undeniable. India didn't benefit from British rule. Britain benefited massively from India. Britain's dramatic rise as a global superpower did not come from British resources alone. Much of it was financed directly by wealth extracted from India. Indian taxes paid for British soldiers, British administration, and British wars, including conflicts that had nothing to do with India. The East India Company's profits funded British banks, ports, and industries back home. Raw materials from India, cotton, jute, opium, tea, coal, and spices were shipped to Britain at extremely low prices. These materials powered British factories during the Industrial Revolution. Finished British goods were then sold globally, often back to India, for huge profits. India became both a supplier of resources and a captive market for British products. Indian money also supported the expansion of the British Empire. When Britain colonized Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, Indian troops and Indian funds helped pay the costs. Britain essentially built a global empire using Indian resources. London's rise as a global financial capital was also linked to Indian revenue. Insurance companies, banks, and trading houses all grew rich from Indian trade. Without India, Britain's global dominance would have been impossible. India was not just a colony, it was the financial backbone of the empire. The impact of British rule didn't end in 1947. India had to rebuild an economy that had been systematically drained for nearly 200 years. At independence, India had almost no industrial base, low literacy, widespread poverty, and deep economic inequality. The country's natural growth had been halted for generations. Understanding this history matters because it explains why India, once one of the world's richest nations, became one of the poorest by the mid-20th century. Colonialism wasn't just political control. It was economic engineering designed to keep India weak and dependent. Many of today's economic challenges, from agricultural struggles to industrial underdevelopment, can be traced back to policies created during British rule. Recognizing this history also gives credit to the resilience of India's people, who rebuilt an entire nation from the ruins of colonial exploitation. Today, India is one of the world's fastest-growing economies, reclaiming the position it once held centuries ago. This story matters not to blame the past, but to understand it, because only by knowing how wealth was taken can we understand how nations rise and fall. In the end, the British Empire may have shaped history, but it was India that paid the price.